You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing. I am delighted to have on today Ben Fleming, and we will be discussing art today. What is it, and what happened to it? Well, welcome, Ben.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, art is one of these questions that I think it's surprising, still stirs a lot of emotions with people in various different ways. And especially if you're in the online, right, there are whole segments of people, looking to revive the past of, when art was beautiful and all of these things. But I think a lot of people who opine on art have no idea what it is, where the idea, quote unquote, of art came from in the first place, and that the kind of things that the Greeks were doing were very much different from the kind of things that the people in the Renaissance were doing. And those, again, were very different from the kinds of things that people started doing in the middle of the 1700s. And even though people are making things that are beautiful, they're doing a thing that we all attach the label art to. All of these different phenomenon are very much different in terms of how you should understand them. And it's important to understand kind of what happened at the end of the 1800s and into the 20th century with this thing called art. And to do so, you kind of have to sort of say, like, hey, where actually did this term art come from? Because they didn't use it in the Renaissance, and they certainly didn't use it in ancient Greece and Rome. So what is this whole thing that is art, and why is it important to understand that, like, what happened in modernity is a very different animal from what went on before in terms of creating beautiful things?
Yeah, so when you say they didn't use the word art in the Renaissance, let me clarify that. Art would have been, the word was in the language, but it would have been synonymous with an artisan. When you talk about the lost art of, tapestry making or whatever, you wouldn't think of that as fine art. You wouldn't associate that with Michelangelo, but the word still did exist. In fact, that even goes back to ancient Greece. You had the concept of the liberal arts, which things like philosophy and medicine, things that free men are supposed to think about, versus the sordid arts, which are things that you would do with your hands. So the word was in the lexicon, but if you were to take a time machine back to Florence at the time of Michelangelo and ask to see the artists, people would look funny at you. They'd say, what, you want to see the tradesmen in town? Just go to any town and find the silversmith or something. That guy is the artist. If you wanted to see Michelangelo, he would have called himself a painter or a sculptor or a craftsman. So going back to something you said there, people in the online right ask, how do we revive art, or how do we create beautiful art? Let me take one step back from that and say, why do we need to revive beautiful art at all? Why don't we just revive beautiful painting and beautiful sculpture? Why do we need this extra concept, this extra layer of abstraction on top of everything?
Well, in that regard, I think there is a good answer for that in the history of technology. This is something that an author that my listeners will be familiar, at least with the name anyways, is Walter Ong. And Ong spent a lot of time analyzing sort of the nature of, like, what is language, print, what is oral culture, and all of these various things. And once you dive into this, you begin to realize that the transition from a culture that doesn't know writing, basically is purely oral, to a culture that has writing, in other words, what Ong calls a manuscript culture, to then a culture that is dominated by print, that these changes change psychology and your relationship to a society's, for lack of a better word, I mean, I know even the word culture is a 17th century or an 18th century, like 1700s idea that begins around the time of Kant and following. But in the creative endeavors of the people, when you can't write things down, you have to remember everything. And so if you think of like the epic poem, you're in many ways remembering in verse the great stories of your people. And so when they remember the stories, these great stories, they do so using stock phrases and they weave a lot of these stock phrases together on the fly, because you're not writing them down, to recount all of these stories of the people. And one of the things that marks a great storyteller is the skill with which he crafts and weaves all of these elements together. And so there is this sense in an oral culture that what you're striving for is not originality, but excellence in the presentation. So for somebody in ancient Greece, the idea, in a sense, that the statue isn't a new medium doesn't bother them. But what they're looking for is the excellence in the presentation, the skill, the arete of the craftsman. You know, do they have, you know, is it excellent? And so these are the kind of quality. And so as you spin it forward, the Renaissance is similar in a sense that it's still dominated. It's mostly oral with some of the psychological changes that have come because of manuscripts. So now you can separate ideas from yourself and you can think about your own history because you can write it down. And so in this, the concept begins to enter into, they begin to think. And so this is where you begin to get in the Renaissance, where they start working out things like perspective and framing and some of these other types of ideas. Many of the things that the Greeks did almost intuitively. And then if you spin it forward from there to say through the printing press to the Romantic era, when you start talking about writing poetry, for example, they would have books of stock phrases. And so you would use these stock phrases to learn how to do poetry. But a real true poet has to be original and creative, in a sense that he has to have his own unique idea. The genius of the artist begins to dominate, and doing something that's merely, in a sense, remembering the past, but doing it with excellence is no longer sufficient. You have to have a creative idea. And so then, as far as, you know, my thought is then, well, what happens when you've exhausted the medium of you know, religious picture, while you turn to commonplace in Dutch, you know, sort of in the Dutch masters, they begin turning to sort of the stuff of common life. Again, the bourgeoisie are rising, the merchant classes are becoming to dominate. And so you have, you know, the subject comes from below. And then once you've exhausted all of the ideas of those other things, then you begin to get into more abstract. The idea begins to dominate. So then you have impressionism and so forth and so forth and so forth. And the ideas then quickly, you begin to realize that it's either a thoroughly derivative, or the ideas are completely exhausted, and it becomes some sort of like, it's either shock or a commodity. And that's sort of in partly the way you end up in the 20th century. And we'll talk maybe some other changes, but that's kind of my, 6,000-foot view of the arc, the grand arc in the West of what happens in art.
Okay, so let's do a bit of a history lesson here. Do you know where the word Renaissance comes from?
It is, from my memory, is that comes from Enlightenment thinkers who are putting that term back onto the period emerging from the High Middle Ages because they had a particular conception of history that they were trying to advance.
So not quite. It does come after the fact, but it comes from the Counter-Reformation. It is coined by Vasari. Now, are you familiar with who Vasari was?
I think so. The name rings a bell.
He wrote a book called The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. Now, this book is often anachronistically translated as The Lives of Artists, but that word did not exist. Now, this book was completely a work of propaganda. In fact, he spends a lot of time trying to get into Michelangelo's good graces, so that this book completely hagiographizes Michelangelo and talks about how Michelangelo is the greatest painter ever, because he's just trying to, stay in Michelangelo's orbit. But this book, you want to talk about the printing press. We often talk about the printing press and its effect on the Reformation and the Protestant world. The printing press had every bit as much of a profound effect within the Catholic world. And this book is probably the example par excellence of that. It is a story going back for the last 200 years of how painting and sculpture and architecture changed since the Gothic age. And this is just your classic example of how the word Renaissance doesn't come into the lexicon until right at the end when you're looking back. He's the guy who coins the term Renaissance, and he specifically coins it to talk about the history of what we now call art. It starts with people like Giotto, who he was called the guy who taught paintings to cry. If you look at Giotto's paintings, the faces look realistic, and you can compare that often, sometimes even in the same church, to the old Byzantine style two-dimensional icons, and they look completely different. They look like a completely different activity. So even though the word art didn't exist, what we almost think of as art as this higher level activity, this more intellectual activity, as you said, you're looking to innovate, to do something new. That is exactly what Vasari is talking about in this book. He talks about starting with Giotto, then going through people like Masaccio, who perfected the painting, and Donatello, who perfected the sculpture, and Brunelleschi, who perfected architecture with the dome in Florence. Then going through the high Renaissance, who are basically, this is the period he lived through. And like I said, he's trying to get in the good graces of the people he likes. And he also talks badly about some of his rivals. Famously, he gives one guy the nickname Il Sodoma. I'll let you figure out what that means, what he's accusing that guy of. He also, there's three centers of art. There's Florence, there's Rome, and there's Venice. And he talks about the Venetian artists like they're people who use bright colors, like they're just trying to be spectacle because they're not talented artists. They're trying to use bright colors to impress the hoi polloi, but they're just doing parlor tricks. Of course, he can't talk about the most famous Venetian artist, Titian, that way. Titian is a little too famous. So how does he deal with Titian? He comes up with a story about how, me and Michelangelo went to Titian's studio. I was impressed, but as we were walking out, Michelangelo said to me, he's not that great. So this is the kind of document this is. It's totally a work of propaganda and hagiography, but this is really where our concept of art comes from, even though it never used the word at the time. And this is the guy who coins the term the Renaissance. Like the term Renaissance is just this guy's history of the last 200 years of what we now call art. Well,
yeah, and they were basically trying to make as you say, like a propagandistic and ideological kind of point that, and many were doing so, like you say, in terms of like Counter-Reformation, doing it to try to mark off a dividing line between a world where the church, in that sense, dominates everything, to a world, this new emerging world of quote unquote culture and learning, the rediscovery of manuscripts, the rise of the universities. And you're beginning to see emerging within Western society many of the fundamental oppositions that are now fully flowered today. And so this idea of the Renaissance is a way of saying we have a new birth of learning and culture and art and all of this kind of stuff. And it's, well, they didn't say culture because that's not a word that really existed at the time, but there's this new birth, this renewal, as opposed to, and this was also another one of these terms that gets, the dark ages that existed between the end of Rome and the rise of the Middle Ages. This is sort of the dark ages where the church dominated everything. And we kind of think of sort of the anti-Christian sentiment as something that really rises with, industrialization in the modern world and modernism, with Kant specifically. But it really begins much, much earlier. You can begin to see the signs of it if you look at and you understand the history of philosophy in around the 1100s even. And so these opposites. So to say that, to use the word Renaissance as a piece of propaganda, they're arguing in many ways that a lot of these happenings in the world of, painting and creation and in writing, literature, in scholarship, these are all things that there's a section of people that are trying to break this away from the authority of the church. And there's an active, it was trying to wrestle learning, creative endeavors from the what they conceive of as the thumb of the church on them. In that regard.
I need to correct two things about what you said there. So the first is, do you know where the term Dark Ages comes from? I just asked, do you know where the term Reformation comes from? Do you know where, Renaissance comes from, but do you know where the term Dark Ages comes from?
No, and I should know.
So just like the term Renaissance was coined by Vasari to describe the last 200 years, and ask how did we get to where we are and where are we going from here. The term Dark Ages comes about the exact same way.
Same time.
It was coined by Petrarch at the end of what we now call the Dark Ages. Sometimes called the first humanist. And he said the Dark Ages are what just finished, and we're now moving into a new era. So again, you see this time and time again throughout history, is that the term we use for a certain historical epoch, that's always comes about at the end of the period, and it's always a thinker who looks back on it. So that's the first point. The second point is about the Counter-Reformation. You talked about breaking away from the church and authority. It's actually the opposite of that. Michelangelo was in the early 1500s, and the Pope just told him, here's a paintbrush, and here's all the money you want. Go do something magic on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You have complete freedom to do whatever you want. The Reformation, like Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, and that causes enough historical action to spend a lifetime studying. But by the 1560s, the Council of Trent, that is when the church realizes that we're not going to be able to beat these Protestants into submission. We have to come up with better ideas ourselves. And one of the things they do is they come up with all of these rules for what Renaissance painting is going to be. So there's no more, Raphael or Michelangelo just telling them, let your genius fly, do whatever you want. Like that's done. If you go to basically any art gallery or any museum, you'll notice a lot of the Renaissance painting is from the 1560s, and it all follows these Renaissance rules perfectly. If you see paintings from before the 1560s or after the 1560s, it's usually something, it's different in some ways, whether the perspective is different, whether it doesn't follow the rule of thirds anymore, it doesn't matter. But it's the stuff from the 1560s. It always follows the rules to a T. And that's the church trying to say, okay, we have to come up with intellectual justification for why people would want to be Catholics instead of Protestants. And this is very much the church trying to take back control, maybe not fully taking back control, but it's interesting. Since I've learned a little bit more about art history, you can't unsee some of these things, and you can't unsee the fact that every time you go into a fine art gallery in a museum, all of the most, picturesque Renaissance paintings, they all have a date like 1564 on them. It's not like something that happened over a couple of centuries. It's always the 1560s.
Well, it is interesting too, though. But it's interesting that you say that, where the church is exerting greater control. I think in part because there is this sense that they are beginning to lose control in that regard.
Absolutely.
Because when you look at the kind of things that Michelangelo is doing in the Sistine Chapel, that there is a kind of like it's a theological commentary on the sort of the biblical worldview and the whole thing of God and man touch, that like there's all the little subtleties and it's a masterpiece in a sense, because it doesn't hit you in the face, but the more that you dive into it and you realize that there is a sense that, the common churchman may not realize this, but Michelangelo was basically doing things up there on that ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that in many ways were poking gently or not so gently at some of the cornerstones of Christian teaching. And so go ahead.
I was going to say absolutely. I'm just saying you have. It's not like this is completely separate from the Reformation or anything. Within 10 years, you have Martin Luther hanging up his theses, and you have people like Erasmus trying to see what they can get away with without being accused of heresy. This is, it's easy to think of Michelangelo as just being this great artist who is completely decoupled from the rest of history. That's right. Absolutely at the same time as all of the other religious strife, or at least when the religious strife is starting. And, it's not like Michelangelo did something great and it inspired the rest of the church. No, all of the great art during the 1560s, during the Counter-Reformation, was the church deciding, okay, Michelangelo was a genius, but we can't afford to just put a paintbrush
let him do this
anymore. We have to
let people keep doing this over and over and again, because it'll be bad for us. Yeah. Well, and the thing is, too, is like also during this time, people have to remember that there is, this is also during this period that, alchemy begins to take off, Hermeticism. So there's all of these ideas that are circulating among this intellectual elite that are circulating kind of around underneath the surface that we often don't talk about. And like you say, these things remain kind of disconnected pieces, and we don't necessarily see how somebody like Michelangelo is tied into the same period as what's happening in the Reformation. Just this was sort of the Italian version of it, and the Northern European version. So in Northern Europe, things got out of hand and the church lost control of it. But in Italy, they didn't. And so that you get very different sort of trajectories in that regard. But at the same time, there's a lot of these other ideas that are swirling around that ultimately end up giving birth to modernity with figures like Kant is sort of the, that's kind of that touchstone. Kant is like the first Nietzsche in that regard.
Well, I'll even take it one step farther than that. On top of all of this, you have Charles V, who just inherited half of Europe. And, he's sometimes been called the original European Union because he wanted to get all of Europe, all of Christendom in one united front against the rest of the world, against the Islamic world as such. And it's sometimes called universal monarchy. He has these policies that he wants all of Europe to get on board with, and it's just a failure if you look at what happens in England and in France, especially. But if you want to talk about the origins of managerialism, you can't decouple it from that either. You can't decouple it from the fact that one guy, he inherits Spain from his mother, and he's got the Flemish lands from his father, and his grandfather was the Austrian Duke, and Spain had just discovered the New World. And when he was a teenager, his grandfather died, and he was just elected Holy Roman Emperor.
Yes, the peak of Habsburg power, right? It's the Habsburg family, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And what's interesting, too, for people, I think, to understand that this element that you're talking about with the Counter-Reformation sort of closing off and sort of reining in the Italian Renaissance, the creative energies that were being unleashed in Europe get passed off to Northern Europe, in part because within the sort of the rise of the bourgeoisie, the merchant classes in Northern Europe, and the commercial empires that they built in sort of, well, especially Holland and the Netherlands, is that this is really why art begins to flower here. So you pass out. So the church kind of closes off, in some sense, in the Counter-Reformation, the religious themes. The Reformation then goes down the route of the whitewashed churches. We're going to get rid of all the idolatry in the churches, all these images on the walls. We're going to teach people how to read, and then art begins to take on now profane subject matter. And so it's in this Northern European context where there's a lot more freedom. In a sense, the church isn't stomping out art. The subject matter is no longer religious. So you don't have worries of blasphemy and so forth. These are all just very mundane type of, you get, and so you get all of like the Vermeers and the Rembrandts and all of these just sort of normal, and you have all this money slushing around in Northern Europe, and they're just hiring these artist studios. And this is maybe a good way, a good segment to look at sort of how the creative process prior to the modern era, because it's very, very different, I think, and most people maybe don't realize this, how art was produced prior to the modern era and the rise of industrialization.
Yeah. Well, for the first, it's not just in Northern Europe. The rise of the Medici family happens at this time as well. And I mean, yeah, Amsterdam is kind of the exception to the rule, being Protestant. Most of the centers of what we would now call capitalism, they are Venice, they're Florence, they're Rome, and places like Augsburg, which are predominantly Catholic, but still have a large Protestant contingent. But we talked about Vasari earlier. He becomes the head of the first academy in, I can't remember if it's in Florence or Rome, and I can't even remember if it's commissioned by the Pope or by the Medici family. But these academies are essentially they're guilds. These are where painters and sculptors pool their resources, and this is where thought leaders start to say, this is the proper way to do a painting, and this is the proper way to do a sculpture, as opposed to having the theologians in the church say it from above. So the whole guild system and the academy system, it absolutely is coincident with the rise of capitalism, both in Northern Europe and in Italy as well. I don't think that's terribly different between the two places. Now, in France, you have the academies. I think they use the word fine arts in France at the time, but that still has a connotation of not being that still has a connotation of being a trade, being something you do with your hands, not necessarily a connotation of doing something higher, doing something with the mind. The word art still has the connotation of being an artisan, but this is where you get the rise of these academies, which we now associate with art history. But even in those days, to be an artist, you were still hoping for a big state commission, or you were hoping for a commission by a noble. You hope to get invited to a noble's court and be commissioned to do his family portrait. In fact, the first two artists to be knighted in England, they were actually both Dutchmen. The first was Peter Paul Rubens. Now, he was a diplomat as well as a painter, so you could argue that he was knighted by the British monarchy for his role as a statesman, not as an artist. But the second one, who was Van Dyck, he was certainly given a knighthood just for being an artist. In fact, for a long time in England, if you had money and you wanted, a big family aristocratic portrait done, you didn't trust your own countrymen to do that. You wanted to bring in a German or a Dutchman to be the person who did your art, who did your portraiture. And that's kind of where the concept of art, as we think of it, starts to develop. Because in the early 1700s, it's seen as it's seen as a skilled trade that you want the finest Dutchmen or the finest German people to come in and do if you want it done properly. But in the mid 1700s, you have Joshua Reynolds, who he was a friend of all the big names of the era, like Edmund Burke and Samuel Johnson and James Boswell and all these people. In those days, you would be part of these social clubs where you would talk to other men of letters and come up with great ideas and write essays. And if you could get them published, you were considered an intellectual in London in the end. I mean, that's not specific to London, but I'm talking about London specifically. But the one club at the Turk's Head Tavern, it's the one that's, it's the one that all of these people belong to. I think Adam Smith belonged to it as well, and David Garrick, all of the greatest minds of London, of 18th century Georgian London. And the two founders were Samuel Johnson and Joshua Reynolds. Now, Reynolds himself was a social climber, and he was, unabashedly trying to do what he could to network with the movers and shakers in society. He was a portraitist, but he was able to finagle himself the position as the head of the new Royal Academy, which was founded in the 1760s. And he was the guy who insisted that I'm not just a portraitist. I am not just a painter. I am an artist. I am doing something bigger. I am engaged in an intellectual pursuit, like I'm a philosopher or a thinker or a scientist. What I am doing is basically a continuation of what Vasari described 2 centuries earlier, even though the word art didn't exist. He gave a series of lectures called Discourses on Art, and basically anytime in the last 300 years, I guess 250 years, if you read anybody's treatise on art, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people's ideas of why what I'm doing is not just new and different, but more intellectually pure, it always harkens back to Joshua Reynolds' discourses, and then it jumps 200 years back to the Renaissance. So that's really, in the English-speaking world, at least, where does the term art come from? It's not something that organically comes about. It is something that is intentionally introduced into the lexicon by Joshua Reynolds when he gets appointed the leader, when he gets appointed to leadership of the newly founded Royal Academy.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned like the Royal Academy, because there's a number of these archaic positions. You think of things like, say, the poet laureate or something, right? And others, but I'm also thinking of when you go back to, say, like in Holland, you and I think there's the same thing in England, but you have the like Royal Dalton, but you have like Royal Delft, like Delftblauw. So you have the Royal Delft, and so a lot of what would happen is you would have an artist who would be the dominant master craftsman, and he would have a whole studio underneath him. And it might be that, like, and so these folks, the apprentices are all studying under this master painter or master sculptor, whatever, but they're all designing these creative elements for producing, painting, sculpture, decorative items. And you would get situations where students would start paintings and then the master would finish them off and sign them. And then you would have, say, maybe for like a lesser family, you might use one of the senior apprentices, but it would still carry the master's name on it. And so sometimes, like, attribution, which is a big thing for today, when you get into this sort of into this earlier period, can sometimes be very tricky. And then, as you say, these master painters would be, from a social status rank, would enter into kind of this lower or like the gentry above your sort of your common shopkeeper, craftsman, and so forth, your common tradesman or even master tradesman. And you would get these royal imprimaturs, so you would have, like, for pottery, for instance, and you would have like Royal Delft, and it now carries the royal seal. Well, once you have the royal seal on your shop, everything that happens in that shop becomes elevated in terms of everybody wants to have now Royal Delft, China and pottery ware with China, but and so now, like, you buy a set of plates from Royal Delft. A set of Delftblauw plates can cost you $2,000, $3,000 for a set of dishes now, even in the 2025. But so you get these kind of, and so like, as you say, you begin talking about some of these artists begin talking about what they're doing as their status begins to get elevated. They then begin to do the theorizing to sort of justify what they're doing, and then to sort of separate themselves from a common craftsman. Well, what I'm doing, and the attribution is the thing of the concept. At least in art now, we're not just merely a guild or a studio. We're doing something special. And I mean, this studio, this guild era is present even up into Impressionism. But I think it doesn't last much beyond that, if memory serves me correct.
Well, so first of all, talking about attribution, before industrialization, you would be the guy who designed the Palace of Versailles, especially because you mentioned decorative arts and the such. You'd have one name on that. Industrialization caused a division of labor. So it's really a 19th century concept that you would have, one person who was the architect, and one person who was the upholsterer, and one person who was a cabinet maker who built all the furniture for a place. That's a relatively recent concept.
Yes.
So before then, it was absolutely the thought leader would have been called the guy who designed Versailles. Had Versailles. It's
just the master painter or the master mason, whoever it was that was in charge. His name would go on it, and everything that happened in that construction would carry his name, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even so everything that happened in your studio, in your shop, if you were the master, that was. And so some of these guys, I mean, you get very, very obsessive about it, but and this is the thing, is that you would want something from this artist. So you'd want him to do your portrait, but that doesn't necessarily mean that master craftsman was the one actually doing your portrait.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, the guy, well, we mentioned Reynolds earlier. I mean, he kind of had a reputation for being the guy who would start the portrait of somebody and then get his assistants or essentially his tradesmen or his technicians to finish it off for him. I think a lot of his students, when he became the leader of the Royal Academy, didn't appreciate him, saying, he was this visionary artist when he relied so much on his subordinates to do the technical and
the grunt work
for him. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, though, too. So then you can see then socially, as like, an artist gets into something like the Royal Academy, where almost by necessity, you have to then justify your existence in the Royal Academy. You have to say that what I'm doing is something special. Yeah, there might be all these guys in my shop that are just applying paint to things, but what really matters is the genius, the concept that I'm giving them, that they're then putting it. And this is sort of, where the concept now begins to sort of take a life of its own almost. And this is probably roughly concurrent with the Romantic period in literature. I would assume. Yeah.
So, a couple you mentioned earlier, or at least you asked, does the Academy system go to the Impressionists? The art history narrative breaks apart, or the art history narrative breaks off from the Academy at the time of the Impressionists, but that doesn't mean the Academy's art's still dominant. That is very much a 20th century imposition after the fact, saying that this is where art goes. If you went to Paris or London at the time and you wanted art, you'd still, like something like 80-90% of it was still sold through the academies.
Yes.
So
it was like cottage industries.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So people have to think about it, that the stuff that you're decorating your estate or your house with, if you're well off enough to, you would be buying, and I'm trying to draw a name, like a well-known impressionist. You would be buying paintings from their studio, and they look very much like the lead artist or whatever, the big with all the ideas. But what you're buying is something that's produced as part of a cottage industry of art making, and it's considered craft and so forth, like you would a piece of furniture. And so it's really this separation into, through industrialization, where this idea of, we generally tend to denigrate something that's produced, sort of mass produced or produced in cottage industries, these types of things. But that was not really a thing prior to this period. You didn't matter because it came out of his studio, so it was his art.
Okay, so I'll clarify a couple things because you asked about Romanticism. Romanticism starts about the year 1800. And like I said, Reynolds becomes the head of the Royal Academy in the 1760s.
Okay, so a little bit before that.
So one of Reynolds's first students is a guy who we completely associate with the Romantic era, and that's William Blake. You often think of him more as a poet than a painter, but he was a painter as well. And the funny thing is that Blake absolutely hated Reynolds. Blake thought that Reynolds was a total blowhard. I think Reynolds would talk about Plato in one sentence, then talk about John Locke in the next, which Blake said, how do you talk about these two like they have anything in common, and yet you're the guy who can synthesize them into one great idea? Also, Reynolds kind of said that he said that painting and sculpture are the real arts, but engraving is just something vulgar. Blake was a talented engraver, so I think Blake had a chip on his shoulder about Reynolds for a few reasons. But the Romantic painters and writers, that was like the generation after Reynolds. That was the generation that Reynolds and his cohort were were educating, and famously you had Turner and Constable at the beginning of the Romantic period. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but you asked about the Impressionists. Now, the term art comes out of the 1760s. It's coined by one guy. It's coined by Joshua Reynolds, who is a social climber. But for 100 years, it doesn't really matter because nobody can afford paints and marble. So what does it matter if the term art isn't all that precisely defined? Because if it doesn't come out of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris or from the Royal Academy in London, it's not art because nobody can afford to make it. The game starts to change around the 1860s when paint starts to become cheaper. And people can, if they don't get into the academy, they can find other ways of doing painting, provided, of course, they can find a buyer for it. And that gives the other half of it. That's the rise of a middle class, rise of the bourgeoisie. In the 1840s, somewhat of a backhanded compliment, at one of the salons, Charles Baudelaire dedicates it to the bourgeoisie, saying, you guys may not know anything about art, but we appreciate you guys buying it. That's one of the big changes in the art world. It's not just the fact that paint becomes cheaper to the point that you can start doing painting outside the academy. The other half of it is there's now actually a market for it. There never would have been a market before. There's enough nouveau riche people who can buy a painting. And the other thing is, if you were part of the academy, you wanted the big state commission, you wanted the big church commission, painting the entire wall. One of these, a bourgeois person wasn't going to be able to afford a painting that took up the entire wall or the entire inside of a church. He wanted a painting that was small enough to hang on his wall. And that's another thing that very much changed the activity of painting. The key name there would have been Gustave Courbet, he was the 1840s. He was a little earlier than the Impressionists, so he wasn't working outside of the system. But what he could do is he could self-promote. So instead of having to go to the annual salon where you showcased your painting and hope that the society's rich people would come in, look at your works, and grant you a gigantic commission, he would just start promoting his stuff on his own to see if he could find any potential buyers for it. It's not like he was a genius who came up with this idea. There just weren't enough nouveau riche people before that. Now, by the 1860s, 1870s, that's when, it's not just that paint supplies become cheaper. It's that there's things like ferrules on paintbrushes made of metal, so you can use a flat brush. You can have a portable easel. You can buy a paint tube. That's an invention of the era as well. Before then, you had to use an animal bladder if you wanted to transport paint. So in this era, you could be the guy who would set up an easel in the park, paint it in a day, and then try to sell it to a merchant or a nouveau riche middle class person. So it's not just one thing that changes everything. You can almost talk about the Impressionists without describing Impressionism. You just talk about
the social changes,
supplies that got cheaper, and the fact that there's a market for it. That's much more important than just somebody like Monet, what exactly he was painting.
Well, and it's also like, and as you're talking about it, you can see the shift between the breakdown in the old, hierarchical world of the nobility, where, as you say, being a painter, you were largely dependent upon the patronage of somebody in the nobility, who would then underwrite, decorating a church, decorating their castle or whatever, or their estate, and so forth, or a big commission for some public building. But for the most part, it was dependent upon this thing of patronage. And now, as you're shifting in this new world of commerce, art also then shifts from something of a medium of patronage to a medium of commerce. So you're now selling your art to a wider audience, and it begins the process of commodification. It becomes an object to be bought, sold, and purchased, rather as something that's just simply commissioned by a personage of some importance.
So that's true in France. We can't forget the other half of that, which is
it's true in Holland as well too, right? So
yeah.
That's
yeah. But I'm saying, the art history quote unquote narrative that every art history 101 book goes through mentions the Impressionists happening in Paris. There's something very artificial about that narrative, because the complete opposite thing is happening in England. In England, you have the arts and crafts movement. John Ruskin is what you'd call an influencer now. He is the big tastemaker in mid-19th century England. He is the guy who essentially decides that the Pre-Raphaelites, the hyper-realistic paintings, are going to become the dominant form of art after the landscape paintings of people like Constable and Turner go out of fashion, after the masters of the landscape painting.
So the pastoral scene.
Yeah. Well, from the current, the current story that we're told, which tries to minimize and airbrush certain things out of history, especially the great things that the British did in the 19th century, it minimizes the contributions of people like Ruskin, who was the dominant critic of his day. And he was very much like a Vasari figure. He was the guy who wrote books about what British art is and why it's great, in the same way that Vasari was writing about Renaissance art in Florence. In fact, Ruskin, he said that the British landscape painting is essentially the equivalent of the British Renaissance. It is not just a great form of art; it's our form of art to be proud of. You mentioned Romanticism. Romanticism in general, it's a counter movement, or at least it's a reactionary movement to the French Revolution, which proved that things could go too far, or maybe it's even a counter Enlightenment movement. It's not quite as opposed to the Enlightenment as like the German Sturm und Drang way of doing things, but there are two things that go ahead.
It's completely dependent upon the changes that were wrought in the Enlightenment through Kant. And so it's funny that, yes, it's a reaction against it, but it's also, it needs the Enlightenment for it to be what it is anyways, right? Because this is where that element of personal genius and the idea really begins, and the original idea and the personal genius of the artist really begins to get cemented into sort of this kind of conception of, like what is art? And what is creative endeavors, poetry, writing, literature, all of these creative endeavors become saturated with this idea of personal genius and the idea and the concept as well.
Well, so there's two things about British Romanticism which are complete, repudiations, and intentionally so, of the Enlightenment. And the first is nationalism, and the second is sentimentalism towards nature. And these are both very much outside of the stream of thought that the Enlightenment era thinkers thought that humanity was moving towards, this hyper-rational world. If you think about it, sentimentalism towards nature, there's nothing rational about it, but it was going to become the dominant way of thinking in England for a century, and from there it would spread to the rest of the continent. Now, when you say personal genius, like I said, there were people who were knighted a century earlier for their creative works, but what really was new about the Romantic era was the artist or the creative putting himself in the work. Like William Blake didn't write a poem about these philosophical ideas. He would write a poem about himself thinking about these philosophical ideas. Or Keats would write a poem about, not about poetry, but he would, in his poetry, he would talk about the creative process of writing poetry in his poems. You know, that's I think what really changed in the Romantic era was it's not just the creative genius, but the genius himself inserts himself into the creative work. It's
in a sense the subject of the genius begins to dominate the creative endeavors. So like you say, it's not even so much about the scene per se, but it's more about my commentary upon the scene. Yeah. Right. So if I'm doing a landscape, it's not just you shift. The important thing is not necessarily a faithful representation of the landscape or trying to capture the essence of the landscape, but it's more, in a sense, trying to capture my feeling about the landscape.
Well, certainly if you look at the paintings of somebody like Turner, that's absolutely true. I mean, Turner was 70 years before the Impressionists, but what he did was Impressionism by another name. Right. In fact, a lot of people think that Monet was inspired to do what he did because he went to England to sit out the Franco-Prussian War, and he would have been exposed to Turner's paintings. And so when he went back to France after the Franco-Prussian War, he brought that style back with him.
And just extended it.
Yeah. Now, I think I got off track when I brought up Ruskin. The reason I brought him up was he and William Morris were in the late 19th century. They were the ones who made a conscious decision that real art is going to reject mass production where possible. It was a reaction to the Crystal Palace, which was built for the 1851 exhibition in London. Now, it was just a gigantic greenhouse. I think Dostoevsky, when he visited
Notes
London,
from Underground.
Exactly. He saw the Crystal Palace and said it was, I can't remember how he phrased it, something like the cold soullessness of progress, something like that.
It was an abomination.
Yeah. Well, certainly Ruskin and Morris thought that way as well. And these were the main people who brought about the arts and crafts movement, who said we are going to really focus on art being handmade furniture and building houses where, as you said, pastoral, where everything feels quaint and cozy, but more importantly, where we reject mass production wherever possible. While France is going in the opposite direction, England is very much trying to reject that, and it's an intentional decision of Ruskin, who is the number one tastemaker of the era. If somebody else had been in the position of Ruskin, it could have very easily gone the opposite direction.
But you almost get a sense where there may be a kind of inevitability to it. But because when you think about it, as you know, you have the art studios, the academies, the idea of, you know, it being like the kind of the guild setting where the master has all the students and the apprentices underneath him. And then you could see how, as you move into an era of the mass production of machine, the Crystal Palace, you know, the factory, and you're beginning as a society, as certain members of society beginning to react against that, you know, well, if we're going to reject the machine, then at the same time, you kind of have to reject also machine-like making. You know, you could see how the academies and the guilds and the studios could be seen as kind of a, a factory, a painting factory. And so in some sense, we have to even reject that whole process to just focus on the creative genius of the artist, who now, in a sense, has because of industrialization, has access to easy, cheap paints. And so thus he doesn't need patronage from like a noble sponsor. And so he's now free to present to the world his particular subjective take on everything, right? And that's, in a sense, and so you can then see how this shift just culturally, as you put these pieces together and kind of watch the historical moment come together, you can almost see this kind of shift as maybe almost an inevitability, given the way that things developed and the events unfolded in time with the introduction of industrialization, that, this kind of subjectivization of art and this emphasis on personal genius would be sort of the natural reaction to the machine, and then thus also the studio process of producing art.
I'll even take it one step farther than what you said about the inevitability. An example that is very specific to us as Canadians is the Group of Seven. The Group of Seven was post-World War I, and this is a time when the rest of the world has decided to move on past this romantic age of sentimentalism towards nature. In Canada, our artists, or at least one group of our artists, decided, no, we're not ready to move on past it. If anything, the age of Ruskin and the age of the landscape, that was Britain 100 years ago, but we want to be so loyal to Britain that we are going to lean into this art form that Ruskin called the British equivalent of the Renaissance. Now, what happened after that? Look at what happened in Britain at the time. You had two books being written. One was J.R.R. Tolkien. He writes The Hobbit, which is, again, this sentimental British romanticism. And it's a well-loved book, but it doesn't enter the British canon the way that the writings of somebody like Tennyson did. Tennyson wrote his poems about Arthurian legend. Now, people knew about King Arthur, but it was always just something that was gathering dust in the back of a library until Tennyson wrote about it, and it became a huge part of the British national spirit. Tolkien probably would have been that had he been born a little bit earlier, but he was a romantic writer who was writing at a time that romanticism had passed. What writing from the 1930s do we remember, or at least what is still relevant to the world of today? Well, it's his contemporary Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, about the soulless world where everything is mechanized. Like that book or dislike that book, it's hard to argue that Brave New World is still relevant to the world that we live in. Whereas Tolkien, it's a nice book, especially if you're in the Anglosphere. It brings up sentimental ideas of, Britain long ago. But, it just doesn't, it feels like it's from a different time and place, even though the book is 5 years newer than Brave New World was. So you talk about the inevitability of things. In Canada, we tried to cling to the old romantic way of doing things as long as we could. But, it still feels
I think the landscape has something to do with that as well, too. I think that part of what makes, and this is one of the things that you have to, that's hard for some folks to understand, that one of the things that shapes the sort of Canadian attitude towards the world and towards life, what we would call our culture, is the various, the main landscapes. I mean, and the biggest of those would be the mountains out west, the prairies, and then the Canadian Shield and the Maritimes. Those are your basic muses. And the Group of Seven really worked in many ways. They focused on the Canadian Shield, but also they did the mountains, they did the prairies, they did the Atlantic province, and they really tried to capture the ethos and the spirit of those landscapes. Like, you can still go out to many of the places that they painted, and you can hold up the painting there, and you can sit in the same spot that the group of 7 artists were sitting in, and you can see the actual landscape, you can see the painting, and you can, in a sense, let the sort of the confluence of those two things kind of come together, in a sense, to capture something essential about what it means to be a Canadian in this particular geographical place.
Well, absolutely, but I mean, it's a lot easier when, especially part of the Canadian spirit then was about being loyal to Britain, and the national ideology was literally about being sentimental towards nature. It was just a match made in heaven.
That's right.
So compare that to in France after the war, when you had all of these avant-garde artists in Paris. They couldn't agree on anything, but they all agreed that we need to move on past Romanticism and, clear the deck and move on to something else. And in Holland as well, the style movement was the same.
It's interesting, guys. I think now that we've kind of set this idea, this notion that, the move up out of modernity, the move out of the studios, and the rise of the idea and subjectivity, and how these came as a reaction to industrialization. There is also at the same time a gradual waning of the influence of Christian society. And it's really the 2 world wars that in many ways put the nail in the coffin of Christian society. And during this time, there is a transition from the Christian faith being the central organizing principle, in the sense that it's the Christian faith that gives people hope for the future, for their condition. And during this period in the late 1800s and the early 20th century, that shift from the church and the Christian faith, it shifts then to politics. And so what ends up emerging from this is that art begins to make this same transition, where it moves from, and we've already talked about how some of that was happening already in with the Dutch masters, and the sort of the vulgar subjects that come because of the rise of the bourgeoisie, that you don't have the prevalence of religious themes because the church isn't sponsoring it to the same degree that it once was. And then with this sort of the nail in the coffin that the 2 world wars represent in terms of Christian society, what emerges in those first 30, 40 years of the 20th century is then art becomes inherently political. So the ideas are still there, but the ideas are now fundamentally political. So they are revolutionary. In many ways, they're revolutionary, but they're also now the ideas are all like they're social commentary. Art becomes a means of doing philosophy about the modern condition in that regard, if that makes sense. I think, yeah. And I think you and I talked about this briefly before we came on air, and maybe just want to lay that out for folks, how that happened. Not only that, I mean, it's easy to see how it happened, but how sort of the particularity, sort of the granularity of why it took on kind of a Marxist revolutionary character, not some sort of other political angle that way.
Well, it's not just that. Excuse me. It's not just that art moved in that direction. It's that our whole argument over what truly is and isn't art, is a banana duct taped to a wall, is that really art? That is largely a rehash of the period between the 1860s and the 1920s, when what we now call art moves out of, I'm not going to say it moves out of the academies, but when there's enough of an ecosystem outside of the academies that people are saying we are doing the true art, we're doing art, the academies are just following the same formulaic rules over and over again. This whole discussion of what truly is and isn't art, it really is just a rehash of that period over and over again. And I don't think we've really moved on past it.
This is a thesis of yours that we're still stuck in the late 1800s.
I think we're stuck in the 1920s specifically.
Yeah.
We're stuck probably about the first 7 or 8 years after World War One. So even in the 1870s, when the Impressionists had their first show, they still never called themselves artists. They called themselves artistic painters. That, they used the word art, but it was the adjective, not the noun. Mm-hmm. And yet, 40 years after that, you have Marcel Duchamp putting a urinal in an art gallery and saying, but what truly is art anyways? So whatever happened in this fairly short period between 1874, when the Impressionists had their first show, and 1917, when Duchamp did that. And the more you look into it, the more you realize, wait a second, it's not even necessarily anything pernicious happening. It's that art is moving in so many different directions, or at least what we call art is moving in so many different directions. Like you said, you had the arts and crafts movement in England, where they were focused on handcrafted furniture. And you had the Bauhaus in Germany, where they were focused on making factory prototypes. And you had Cubism in Paris. And you had all of these different things happening. You could just as easily make the argument that maybe by the time you reached the 1920s, art had moved in so many different directions, and so many people were using this term art, that maybe it just wasn't a coherent concept anymore. But still, you look at the whole history of the 19th century, at least as the story is told, it's told as a series of movements. You get Constable and Turner, then you had the Pre-Raphaelites, and in France you had the Realists, and you had the Barbizon School, and then you had the Impressionists. As the story is told, admittedly completely after the fact, the group of creatives would do something, and then that would become the dominant style for 20 years or so, and they would just expect that 20 years or 30 years later, the next upcoming generation of painters and sculptors would have a new set of ideas. And it's easier to assume that in the age of industrialization, when the world literally looks different every 20 years. There was just there was the expectation that what we call art would be this moving wavefront from one creative movement to the next. And after World War I, there was a lot of utopian thinking about this world of industrialization and factories. When I think of that, I just think of a gray concrete jungle. But there are people who are looking at that with hearts in their eyes, thinking, okay, this is the dawn of the 20th century. We can't wait to see where art is going to go. But to be completely honest, I don't think it's really gone anywhere. I don't think there's anything done after 1925 that was not done before 1925. I was talking about Duchamp earlier. I mean, he's cross-dressing and doing graffiti, and making pretentious statements like, but what truly is art anyways? If you look at what every contemporary artist is doing, and it's not just Duchamp, it was done in Russia as well with the constructivists. I don't think there's anything that you can find in the contemporary art world that was not already thoroughly beaten to death within the first 7 or 8 years after World War I. So what happened there was, I think, all of this creative energy that was put into aesthetics started to get sucked out of the room and going into other things like political movements and revolutionary movements, especially after World War I. And Woodrow Wilson had decided to jump into World War I and not let Europe sue for peace until they made the continent safe for democracy. That was the slogan that they used. And what does it mean when your continent is now safe for democracy? It means you have to have these ideologies in the name of the people. There's a reason that you get a very 20th century phenomenon called the ideological dictator in this period. You have people like Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and Lenin. These are people who rule their countries, if not with a complete iron fist, then at least in an authoritarian way. Mussolini wasn't as iron-fisted as we like to think he was when you really look into him. But you know, the 20th century phenomenon is the ideological dictator, the guy who is doing everything in the name of this ideology that's at least nominally in the name of the people. Even though, you know, if the people don't like it, they're going to end up in the gulag. This is a very 20th century phenomenon. Sorry, there's a fire alarm going on behind me, so just give me a couple of seconds.
Is that outside? Is that out in the hall?
Yeah, it's apparently it's coming over the intercom. So they're saying it's a fire alarm. It's not a real one, but
there you go.
It sounds like it's done now. Murphy's Law, like I said.
You know, you begin to wonder too. Like, I mean, I know people are still painting, and you know, you can see art that is being done, and there are still creative people that are still applying themselves in the arts. But you're right that in a sense that in terms of something that you could say where the creative endeavors are capturing the ethos of a cultural moment in society, that in many ways Art Deco is kind of just the last gasp. It seems like Art Deco seems to be pointing to the great and glorious future, and that's one of the sort of the dichotomies of Art Deco. But that kind of gets killed almost with World War II, and so there was a sense where Art Deco flowers, and you have this, you know, it's like what we talked today, this kind of vitalist energy, social energy, and it has a unique ethos and style. But then once Art Deco is done, it's really kind of done. And it's at that point, I mean, there's art is still being made, people still buy it, it's a commodity, but it doesn't have the sense of cultural force that it had prior to that.
Yeah, I mean, you said people are still doing painting, and they absolutely are. You know, anybody can go take a painting class at the community college and learn how to paint. Some people are quite talented about it, but you know, somebody from Memphis, Tennessee, who takes painting classes and paints absolutely beautiful things, they're not going to end up in the high prestige art galleries, and they're not going to get written about in the culture pages of the New York Times. So, like you said, you know, is there something that captures the zeitgeist? Yeah, there probably is more of that than there ever has been. It's just you never find out about it. In fact, you know, the 20th
that
century.
Is true.
Yeah.
Well, the medium has shifted as well too now. Like the quote unquote creative medium now is social media, right? It's visual arts, it's video, it's television, and the plastic arts have largely been superseded by the digital in many ways, and that's just sort of like where those endeavors are going. They're going into like television, and they're going into you know, print magazines and so forth, and they're going into social media and TikTok videos. That's where a lot of this energy is going into now. Yeah, so people still paint, and they're still, you know, for tax reasons and so forth, people are still, you know, buying overpriced art because it's a commodity and you can write it off for your taxes. But there is this sense of, does it actually mean anything anymore? And you know, and that's, I think, a really open question that way.
Well, did it ever mean anything in the first place is maybe more of a question. Like if somebody makes beautiful and profound paintings or sculptures or anything else in the plastic arts, if they got a write-up in, again, the cultural pages of the New York Times, I think there would be a lot of energy for it. So I'm not sure if that's the right question to ask. It's like the gatekeepers don't want to let the beautiful stuff in. They want to talk about somebody duct taping a banana to the wall and then talk, and then write a 1,000-word column in the New York Times about how this truly makes us think about modernity, or think about, or challenge us to start a conversation. That there's always these words about it, but that
it's the idea. The idea has become to dominate, and so in that sense, it takes over. I do have to say, Ben, as much fun as I've enjoyed this conversation, I have to go now. I've got some stuff pressing on me from outside.
Okay.
But yeah, no, because I'd love to talk for another 15 or 20 minutes about this notion. Maybe we could pick it up again some other time. But this idea, but you have been, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. But you have been doing a series on this. If somebody in the audience is interested, you have done sort of a magisterial series to answer this question of why is a toilet art? Mm-hmm. And I think that was sort of the fundamental question that opened it all up to you, is why is this stupid toilet art, and what does it mean? And then you've, like, how many hours you've been?
30 so far. 30
hours.
And counting. I've always wanted to write a book. I've figured at this point, I'm so far into this, I just want to get the story finished. And I don't care if nobody reads this, but a couple of my relatives. I just want to, again, talk about the imprimatur. I want to put my own imprimatur on this, and I don't care if nobody else reads it. I have, put this story out into the world, because there is just, I don't want to say there's a lot of, misinformation out there, but there's a very specific narrative that, I'll just not going to mince words, that narrative is owned by the Museum of Modern Art right now. And they say what the true history of art is and is not. Every time you have a toilet put into an art gallery, it has to be accompanied with, at least a paragraph of how it starts a conversation. And museum copy has always been a little bit, pretentious in the first place, but it's extra pretentious now. So I want to go through the official narrative of what quote unquote art is. And I want to see how much of this is accurate and how much of it is not accurate. Spoiler alert, a lot of it is not accurate. And how do you tell? You tell by just putting a lot of the events in chronological order and realizing, oh, wait, things couldn't have unfolded the way that we are told about in the traditional art history narrative.
Yeah. Very good. And where can they find your page, Ben?
Radio Free History. Follow me on Twitter if you want, but I got my link in my Twitter profile. But just look up Radio Free History on YouTube. I mean, it's a podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts, but YouTube is where you can see the visual component, which you probably want for an art history series.
You do. Awesome. Very good, Ben. Thank you for being on, and all the best.
Yeah, you as well.